I want to review another article about helping students to improve their academic writing skills. This is a really good article that was recently published in 2020, so I'm going to dive straight into that undertaking. The article is entitled Enhancing the Academic Writing Abilities of First-Year Bachelor of Education Students in a Blended Learning Environment. It's by David Scott, Sam Ulmer-Kroll, and Jason Ribeiro. Published this year, 2020, in the International Journal of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. So, the problem that the authors are addressing is that it's widely recognized that B.Ed students, first-year B.Ed students, beginning their undergraduate journey, struggle with a few things. Firstly, they struggle to stay focused on a clear, answerable research question in their writing. Anyone who's taught tertiary first-year students knows this is not a B.Ed problem, it's a pervasive problem. Secondly, they struggle to synthesize insights from research literature and cite it correctly. And thirdly, they struggle to develop and elaborate on a few key ideas rather than just introducing a whole collection of loosely or unrelated ideas that they treat in a fairly cursory or superficial way. The problem is in part aggravated, at least in the author's view, by the fact that teachers outside of those teaching English classes specifically tend to accept poor writing. In other words, they don't fail students or penalize them heavily for poor academic writing, and they do it for two reasons. Firstly, it's incredibly labor intensive for somebody teaching courses that are not specifically writing courses to spend a lot of energy helping students to improve their writing skills. And so, content teachers tend to prioritize focusing on content issues, and they let students slide in a sense with their limited writing ability and skills. So the authors set about a study that would include both a literature review and an experiment. They anchor in a methodology called educational design research. It's a kind of participatory research, very qualitative in nature, really worth looking at for anybody who's looking to do similar kinds of studies. I really like the methodology. I hadn't seen it before. It looks usable for a wide range of projects. Essentially, it has two components. It begins with a detailed literature review, and then based on the literature review, they design a participatory experiment and then follow the qualitative experimentary process. Now, in their literature review, the authors discovered three critical design principles. In other words, they said there's a lot of literature out there about how you help students to improve their academic writing, and three design principles emerged from the 26 empirical published articles that they surveyed. Number one, when it comes to the technology, it's not so much what technologies you use as how you use them that matters most. So whether you're using wikis or discussion forums or instructional videos, most of the literature will say any and all of these can be effective or ineffective. It all depends on how they are used. The second design principle is that writing is a social collaborative act. This is counterintuitive, but there's a growing body of literature that says the picture of the solitary writer who works in isolation and produces great work is something of a myth. Writing is a collaborative act. It's at its best when people are interacting, sharing ideas, sparking new thoughts in others, giving feedback on peers or partners' work, etc. And then thirdly, the effectiveness of improving writing skills depends heavily on ongoing feedback loops. So the idea is that somebody writes something, gets constructive feedback on it, then works and improves it, and you get more feedback. So you have this looping around of writing and receiving feedback. So they set about building these principles into an educational course, but with the side priority of helping B.Ed students to improve their writing skills. They designed an experiment. They ran the experiment over 2 years, and they made some adjustments for the second time that they ran it. Essentially, they designed this educational course and they built a few of those design principles into the way they ran it. They did it in a few ways. Firstly, they had some interactive lessons, 2 of them to be specific. These were authored in articulate storyline, and so this is interactive content that students work through. The second element is 2 discussion forums, fairly standard discussion forums. These were set up to encourage students to submit work in progress and then get feedback from both instructors and peers and then continue to refine that work iteratively as they chipped away at it. The third element was writing seminars. So it was a blended learning course, and they had 2 moments in the course where they got the students together in a seminar style and workshopped some of the principles of good writing and got students to collaborate in that sense. Then they built in a feedback meeting. So each student got one opportunity to meet one-on-one with an instructor and to receive personal feedback on their writing. And then the second time, remember they ran this twice, so the second time they did it, they added an element. They added some instructional videos which they used in a flipped classroom structure. And then they did a qualitative exercise where they interviewed and did focus groups to try and understand how students experienced these different kinds of learning activities and what helped them and didn't help them to improve their writing abilities. And they made some discoveries about each of them. With respect to the interactive lessons, the responses were mixed. Some students found them useful, some didn't. There were 2 critiques though. The design of the particular articulate lessons were such that students were too passive, and they wished they could have redesigned them for more active interaction, but they just didn't have the opportunity to do that. Another deficiency is that students struggled to see the connection between the interactive lesson and the assessed writing tasks, and that sense of irrelevance was a barrier for them. The discussion forums were unanimously reviewed by the students in a fairly negative way. They disliked particularly the sense of being reviewed by peers and needing to critique peers. Ironically, the instructors had a pretty positive view of the discussion activities and even of the quality of feedback that students were giving to fellow students. The writing seminars were viewed hugely positively. So the opportunity to gather in a small group, to workshop concepts, to practice it, to share some of your writing and get pointers, this was incredibly helpful and students reviewed it positively. Similarly, they reviewed the one-on-one feedback meetings with their instructors very positively. And lastly, with the introduction of the instructional videos at the end, this too was viewed as very positive. The ability to get key bits of training right at the point where they needed them was experienced as a helpful addition to the course as compared to the first time that they ran it. So there were a couple of key findings that the authors concluded. One was that feedback loops and peer review are important components of writing development. Feedback loops are important. So this ability to write something, get some pointers and guidance, and then develop it. This is a key strategy for helping people to acquire writing skills. But the problem is that it is hugely labor intensive. So it's too labor intensive for an instructor to give this iterative looping feedback to an entire cohort of students, especially if it's a reasonably sizable class. They were dealing with a class of 180 students, if my memory holds. And so they proposed that the only way this can be done is by effectively harnessing some mechanisms of student peer review and feedback. Those are double-edged, but it's probably the only way that you can build in feedback loops without making course design too onerous for the instructor. And the other key takeaway was this realization that writing is a collaborative community type exercise. And so finding ways for people to work together, to feed off, to encourage, to prod, to nudge, to probe, etc. This is incredibly helpful. They found it most helpful doing it in their seminar space. We in an online space probably need to figure out alternative ways of accomplishing the same thing. So, a very interesting study about improving writing. Key takeaways: feedback loops are important, but they're very difficult to implement because they're so labor intensive if it's instructor based. And then this need to have some kind of a community, a collaborative community type project was confirmed, as was the sense that when it comes to the technologies, it's probably not so much which technologies you use, but how you use them that determines whether they're helpful or not.